Well, everyone, on the November the 30th, we have the first event of our Franciscan centenary. 800 years ago, on November the 30th, the Friars' Rule was formally approved. The rule that we live today was formally approved. But the story about this rule, I'm not going to start at the beginning. I'm not going to start at the end. I'm going to start in the middle, because it is as part of the development of the rule that we understand the time and the place and what was going on. Well, I'm going to start at virtually what the height of Francis Sussex. He was successful. He was out he visited the Sultan. He was in the Holy Land. He was with the friars. We think he'd managed to get to see some of the Holy Land holy sites. And in many ways, it was almost the height of what could go wrong. But in 2019, while he was on the coast of the Holy Land, two friars come from Italy and say, things are going wrong back home. Yes. You need to come back home. And so St. Francis, one of the stories says, he basically leaves the food on the table, he gets up and he goes back to Italy. So what was the crisis going on? Well, the crisis was one that was occurring was there were non-gospel rules were being introduced. We know that while St. Francis was away, the friars got together and introduced some fasting rules that weren't part of Francis's understanding of their life. Why was he upset about that? We'll come to that. The other thing was the growing clericalization of the order. More and more priests were joining the order, and that was changing the very nature of the movement. There was also some specialization, and the friars were now starting to own things. Well, or they were starting to look after things, like the leper colonies, where before they used to serve within them, now that they were managing them and running them. And then there was the issue of the lack of formation. So all those things were the things that he came back to when he got back into Italy and he saw what was the problem. Yeah, so how did we get there? Well, all of you know I'm going to go to his initial conversion, and really that the whole sense of what Francis had established his life on was from his personal experience, where he had experienced a sense of loss. He had experienced meeting the leper, and it changed his life. He'd heard Christ's voice from the cross, asking him to go and rebuild his church. And he'd left the world and been welcomed by the bishop in Assisi. And he said that initial conversion of building churches, of going out and working with his hands, of going out and meeting people, where he was someone who was from the wealthy middle classes of the Middle Ages. He now reached out to the poorer people around him. So for him, that was part of his experience. He lived amongst the minores of his community, among the poorest of his community. And so we know that that Feast of Matthias, where he opened up the gospel, when some other people saw that what Francis was doing, we think it was Brother Bernard and potentially Brother Giles would join the friars at that time, where he opened up the gospel and he looked at the gospel passages and they said, this is the life that we are leading. And so he went from that gospel to life to gospel that's so much treasured by particularly our third order brothers and sisters. That was Francis's life. They looked at the gospel and tried to work out how to live it. So we get those first statements. If you wish to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give money to the poor. You want to be my follower, then let them decide themselves and take up their cross and follow me. From life to gospel, gospel to life. That's what was Francis's understanding of what his life was. That's what attracted those early friars to who Francis was. And we sometimes, the form of life, the forma vita is, for him, it was a very simple message of just living the gospel. In many ways, when we say, what did St. Francis and the early brothers take to Innocent III? Well, what their message was about, we just want to live the gospel. We want to make the gospel alive. And we say here in some of the sources that they had a very simple rule that they took to Innocent III. And it was purely that sense of making the word of the gospel come alive. So that is what they took to Innocent III. And really the permission from Innocent III was about go and try it. We see in some sources that some of the people there thought that it couldn't be done. They thought that the life would be too hard. And so in many ways, Innocent III's recognition at that time was go and try. See if it works. But we also got to remember that early rule, that early life is actually what attracted other people to the life, the Franciscan life. So it is, and during that period of time, before we even had what we call the early rule, when we had that sense of that looking at the gospel and living the gospel, that's what attracted St. Clare. That's what attracted the early Third Order. Because, St. Clare and her sisters, they were attracted by the life that the early brothers were living, the gospel life, a life on the streets, a life amongst the poor. That is what attracted St. Clare. So Clare in 1212, this is before the official early rule. This is before the formal rule. It was that very simple rule and life that attracted St. Clare and her sisters. And similarly, amongst the Third Order, we think that Lucicius and Belladonna are actually around that 1212 time is when they are attracted by the life of St. Francis. Again, there was no rule except other than the gospel. That is what St. Francis was living. And that's what attracted those early members of the Third Order, our current secular order. That's who they were. So that early rule that we see slowly developed out of an understanding of living the gospel. Again, that not accepting money was a response to both the gospel message and the reality of the things on the ground. Their desire to work and to beg, in many ways, was coming from Francis' understanding of he was called to live amongst the poor, to be poor with the poor, to work alongside the poor, and when they didn't have food, to beg just like the poor begged. So it is about living the gospel, but also the reality and the experience on the ground. All these things were the things that ultimately flow into what we come to in the early rule. But at that early stage, in 1219, 1220, it was still a rule in development, a rule of continually examining the gospel, of talking with each other about what it meant to live the gospel life. So again, it was a very fluid thing and very much built on the Friars' association with Francis, about his experience and how he shared it with them and their experience, and as they continued to share their life with each other. So that's where that early rule starts to come from. And again, that early rule that we have is very much one that's been put together over time. It wasn't written in, as let's sit down and write a rule. It was written from experiences over the time and through the early life of the order. We know in 1214, Francis and Bernard, we think went to Spain. We at least know that Bernard got there and he became the provincial in the Spanish province. In the Lateran Council of 1215, that changed very much the friars too, because what happened was the church started to introduce education for religious and for priests. That was very much part of what the Lateran Council was, inviting priests and things to learn more and be able to preach more. Again, it's also at the Lateran Council where Francis actually got the symbol of the tau, because it came from one of Innocent III's homilies to the Lateran Council, inviting a sense of conversion amongst all the participants there. Sometimes we think that tau message came a lot earlier, but it's at this point where Francis is listening to the church and what the church is asking for, that he responds for those things around him. The friars, even before the early rule, had gone out in mission, had gone out into new places, reaching out, in a sense, to take the gospel to the four corners of the world. So they were in Spain. Elias was already in Syria. The friars had already starting to venture into Germany, France, and Morocco. And of course, in 1219, that is why Francis went on the Crusades. In many ways, Bill Short says, why did Francis go on the Crusades? Well, he went because he did all those things because the gospel invited him to do, which was to go and love his enemies. And who were the biggest enemies for Christendom at the moment? Well, they were the Muslim people and the confrontation between Christendom and Islam. And so he went to go and love the Sultan. Yes, to convert him, because if you love someone, of course, from a Christian point of view, yes, we want to embrace someone and call people to Christ. And so that's why St. Francis went, continuing that message of the gospel message. That already experienced the martyrdom. We were starting to get more educated people start to join the friars. And so by 1220, St. Anthony of Padua had joined the friars, a very educated man who came from a monastery in Portugal. So when Francis got back and saw what had happened, that the friars now were no longer people living amongst the minority. They were no longer people who were experienced the gospel in the way he experienced it. They were now, in a sense, trying to work out how to become a formal organization. There were more educated friars joining, more priests joining. And so many of the assumptions that Francis had before he left for the Holy Land were now being challenged by the brothers themselves and their experiences when he had been around. So they were moving in more educated manner. They were becoming of more service to the church. And so that was actually changing the nature of the early movement. In many ways, it was a crisis of success. It was the friars actually becoming, at this point, and also the whole of the Franciscan movement, the friars, the sisters, the Third Order, was starting to be a movement that the church itself could see was a success. But at the same time, that there were difficulties of organization. There really wasn't the organization. It relied very much on Francis's own personality and the relationships that people had with Francis, and his sense of how he interpreted the gospel and how they shared and lived that life. But as more and more of the priests are coming in from different parts of the world and different understanding about what religious life was, it challenged what Francis's initial life was about. So as I said, they were starting to follow non-gospel rules. They were picking up some of the fasting rules of the regular church. And the reason why they were doing that was the reason why Francis did not have all the fasting rules of the monastic order was that you lived a poor life, you were living amongst the poor. Hey, you were grateful for any food you received. You didn't need to fast because fasting, in a sense, was imposed upon you. But as the friars started to leave that sense of life, they were choosing to move away from being minorities and living in the towns and the cities. They were starting to actually have to choose to fast rather than having fasting imposed on them by the lifestyle that they led and where they were. Similarly with the clericalization of the order was looking for more education. And so it is this time that we have the whole issue of Francis turning up to Bologna and finding the friars had moved from the outskirts of Bologna into the center near the university, and the people had built a house for the friars, which was being called the Friars' House. For this, it really challenges Francis's idea of what his movement was all about. When people were talking about this is the friars, this is what they own, it was challenging Francis's understanding. The lack of formation was also being commented upon. We know that people had written to the Pope and saying these friars, they're doing some good stuff, but there is a real lack of formation in them. They're just enjoying the friars, and in many ways they don't understand the gospel. They don't understand the life that Francis was talking about. And in fact, the church itself, the Pope itself, actually wrote to the friars and wrote to other religious telling them that they needed a year of formation, in a sense, the novitiate that we have today, that it was required. And that was in response to what was going on within the Franciscan movement. And then, of course, some of the friars now had a sense of ownership of the leper colonies that they once lived within and worked amongst the people. Now, in a sense, they were running them and in charge of them. So when before they used to work alongside the poorest, now they were in a sense of ownership, a sense of not being a minority. And again, this is what Francis was so upset about when he came back from the Sultan in 1219. And this has started a great argument amongst the Franciscan movement. Both the church and the leaders of the Franciscans, other than Francis, almost suggested that they should adopt one of the other rules. They should adopt the rule of Benedict, the rule of Augustine. They should adopt one. In fact, even the Lateran Council, the call in 1215 not to have another rule. You know how we get around it, because we say that Innocent the Third already approved the way of life. But the friars actually challenged Francis and said, no, we need some order. We need one of the existing rules. But Francis rejected that. For him, it was a challenge. So Francis's response was, my brothers, God has called me by the way of simplicity and showed me the way of simplicity. I do not want you to mention to me any rule, whether of St. Augustine or St. Bernard or St. Benedict. The Lord told me what he wanted. He wanted me to be a new fool in the world. God did not wish to lead us by any way other than this knowledge. But God will confound you by your knowledge and wisdom. So in many ways, he was attacking more of the learned friars who were adopting a different position than he was. So the new rule that he wrote, that has become the formal rule, re-emphasized the centrality of the gospel life. And he re-emphasizes the importance of the gospel. The other thing is, once upon a time, where the friars lived amongst the poor, lived with the poorest, they knew what poverty was. They knew what humility was because they were living it. now Francis basically had to put it into the rule. And in fact, the new rule is actually stricter than what the early rule was, because now he had to actually teach the more learned friars that the life of poverty and humility was what they were called to do. And so that is in our rule now. It's actually more emphasized about poverty. It's more emphasized about humility, because what had happened was they had moved away from the poorest people, and that they were, in this case, becoming more of service to the church generally. And so Francis had to re-emphasize the early learnings that he had by living amongst the lepers. You had to re-emphasize that new sense of work, and a sense of size of being always in need of God's help, and in being in needs of others. Because when you're successful, people, give you many things and will support you. But Francis remembered the time when he wasn't successful, when he was in need, and he wanted to remind the friars about this issue, about that sense of minority, of humility. Again, from his learning of experience, the experience that he had by meeting the Sultan, the experience he had by seeing his brothers being martyred in Morocco, the new rule emphasizes peace. It emphasizes, it doesn't have the same missionary rule as the early rule, but it does have that message that we are not to quarrel, we're not to engage in arguments, that we are meant to be the people of peace. It especially picks up on some of the issues of the early rule about mutual care and of looking after each other. And again, that servant's leadership is re-emphasized, that we are not called to be the hierarchical model of the bishops. We're not called to be the hierarchical model of the abbot in the monasteries. Our leaders are called to be servant leaders, and Francis wanted to remind them of that. And of course, he responded in the new rule that he wrote to a greater form of formation amongst the friars. So why do we say that the new rule emphasizes the centrality of the gospel? Well, Francis starts the new rule and ends the new rule with the emphasis on the gospel. He emphasizes that we observe the holy gospel by living it. He finishes it by saying, let us observe poverty and humility and the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, which we firmly promised. For Francis, the beginning and the end is always the gospel. That's the heart of the Franciscan life. That is the heart of what Francis invited the early followers about, was that sense of the gospel centrality in our life. At the end of the day, what are we called by in the gospel to do? We're called to be foot washers. We're called to be humble people that are willing to wash the feet of the poor. We see that in Jesus at the Last Supper, washing his disciples. But each one of us are called to be foot washers of those in need. We are called to be boundary crossers, just like Jesus meeting the Syro-Malabar woman, and Francis' experience of going to the Sultan and going beyond the church boundaries, beyond Christendom. We are meant to be people who bring the church into someplace new. We're always meant to be boundary crossers. And even though we are meant to be people of poverty, we are always people of hospitality. We're always people who welcome people, even if we don't have much. And the friars and the Franciscan movement was about not having much, but we are meant to welcome everyone with hospitality, recognizing that everyone is brother and sister. That emphasis of being Christ for others is renewed again. It is never said in the early rule or in our current rule, but it is re-emphasized by the life that Francis lives. So that poverty and humility. Once again, in the new rule, it's re-emphasized about not receiving monies and coins, about work as the centrality of work amongst the friars, that they're not meant to live on the rich incomes of the large churches, which they were starting to look after. Francis continued to remind them they are meant to be pilgrims and exiles. So that very heart of the Franciscan thing is that poverty but the more important thing is the poverty and humility of the God that we follow, is that Jesus came as a naked baby, vulnerable, someone who needed people's care. He left us naked on the cross and left almost alone on the cross. God's humility is shown by the very simple act that God comes to us in the simple elements of bread and wine. In many ways, the Franciscans, when we talk about poverty and humility, it is always about following the poverty and humility of Jesus. It's not the poverty and humility of Francis. It is the poverty and humility of the God that we love, about how Jesus came into the world. And so that poverty is a sense of being with those who are the poor of God, the Anawin, the people who desire God and need God in their lives. That is the heart of the poverty that Francis is talking about, because that's the poverty that Jesus was talking about. And we are, again, Francis realized that we are called to be people of peace. We are called, it is emphasized in particularly our rule and in the secular Franciscan rule, that we are called to be people of peace. We're warned in the Friars' rule, we're warned not to quarrel, not to argue with others, nor to judge. There's a continual reminder of that sense that we are meant to be people of peace. We're meant to be people of fraternity. Once again, both in the early rule and then the final rule of the friars, we are reminded that we are meant to care for each other. And mutual care is the heart of the Franciscan life. That continuous sense of fraternity, of dialogue, of listening and caring for each other. And I think that's most beautifully summed up in the letter that Francis writes to Brother Leo. Brother Leo, health and peace from Brother Francis. I'm speaking, my son, in this way as a mother would, because I am putting everything we said on the road in this brief message and advice. If afterwards you need to come to me for counsel, I advise you thus. In whatever way it seems better to you to please the Lord God and to follow his footprint and poverty, do it with the blessing of the Lord God and my obedience. And if you need and want to come to me for the sake of your soul or for some consolation, Leo, come. The heart of our Franciscan family is that continuum of trust of each other, that continuous reminding of each other that each one of us are called to follow Christ in our hearts, for each one of us to discover amongst ourselves what Christ is calling for me, which sometimes is not calling you, he's calling me, he's calling you to something different. But we are called to support each other and look after each other, and so that we can discern God's will amongst us. That again is part of the whole Franciscan family of discernment of the presence of God, and why we are brothers and sisters to each other, that we're all helping each other to find out what God is calling for us. So as I said in that final rule, that importance of formation was emphasized, and the friars have picked that up, as I said, in response to the demand of the church itself. That reminder to always to be servant leaders. As I said, that we are not the hierarchical model of the monasteries, nor the hierarchical model of the bishops. We are meant to be servants to each other. That beautiful line that is in the friars' rule is that the friars can speak to our ministers as lords with servants. For so it should be, because the ministers are the servants of all the friars. And so even if the friars are finding it difficult to follow the rule, they're finding, losing in a sense the ministers are called to be of help to each one of the friars and to care and look after each other. And again, that flows throughout the whole Franciscan family, that sense of that our leaders are always our servants for each one of our family. And again, that education tradition. And again, Francis started off being very, very skeptical of education. He called for the friars to be people that actually brought their own gifts, each one of the things that they gift, and that was enough. But already in the time of Francis, when he wrote the new rule, the friars were starting to enter more and more into education. And as said, the only reason he approved Brother Anthony to teach the friars was because of Brother Anthony's love of the gospel life and his sense of humility. So I'm pleased that you teach the sacred theology to the brothers, providing that is contained in the rule, you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion during study of this kind. So that whole sense of that importance of prayer, that importance of dependence of God is always reminded. As I said, Francis was very skeptical that education could be used as a sign of power. And that was his very big concern. His very big concern about the holding of breviaries and other things was that sense of that people used them as power and privilege rather than a sense of service and worshiping God. That was his concern. So our rule in 1220, we see that Francis actually resigned and he named two new friars, Peter Catani and John Perienti, to be, in a sense, be vicars. And in many ways, Francis sort of retained the spiritual leadership of the movement, but these two friars looked after all the administration. And Francis himself placed himself under the obedience of the other friars. And so he started to live his life as an example for others. He himself was willing to let go and show what minority is all about, show what humility all about is. So our summary of the rule, our Franciscan rule, is very much that emphasis is that the approval of the rule in November 30, 1223 is very much an approval by the church of the whole Franciscan movement, of Francis's emphasis on the gospel life, his emphasis on caring and looking for after each other. And it is also for the friars, it is a reminder of that early thing where Francis and the early brothers used to live amongst the poor. Now he's in the new rule, he is teaching what the learnings of living amongst the poor are about and sharing them with the other brothers. So at that heart of the rule that we all live, that rule to live the gospel, that is the heart of our Franciscan movement. That is what the church approved. In many ways, by handing over the rule for the church's approval, all of the Franciscan movement are saying, we are now under the service of the church. Our rule is not ours, it's actually now the church's, and that we are called to live under it. So in many ways, we've got to remember that our initial rule and the rule in the sense that we continue to live under, that rule in life is always first the gospel message. And it is that living of the gospel that attracted St. Clare. It is the living the gospel that attracted the early third order, our secular brothers and sisters. It is that living of the rule that attracted the third order regular, our Franciscan brothers and sisters in the world. That living the gospel and trying to bring the gospel life is the heart of our life. The other part of the life is to remember to continue to look through the eyes of the poor, of those people who are the people who are in need of God's help and dependence. All of us are invited us to see through those eyes and to respond. As I said, as the friars got, in a sense, more privileged in status, they didn't experience it on a day-to-day level, but Francis kept on reminding them to see through the eyes of the leper, see through the eyes of the minority. Well, Francis, when he had the rule approved, he actually became a new person. When Francis let go of the leadership, he had the rule approved. It is then that he started to work on, in a sense, his own life of being Christ to others, of being brother and sister, being in communion, being in the world. So Francis said it is in 1223, after the approval of the rule, that we do have the miracle of Gretio. When Francis now is fully happy, in a sense, returned to who he was when he first converted to his life. And again, for him, I think that experience of Gretio, that going back and setting up what Christ's entry into the world was for him a rebirth in his sense of who he was and what his life was about. So that miracle of Gretio, where the word becomes flesh, where people actually saw the Christ, baby Christ, being held by Francis amongst the animals. For Francis, in a sense, is the new birth of his life and living in the life that he was called to live the gospel, to bring the gospel to life. We also, in many times at this time, there is no mention of creation and loving animals in the Franciscan rule, but as Francis's life, it is his return to a sense of living the gospel and, in a sense, entering into the kingdom of God and building up these relationships that sense of peace becomes about. And then we get the stigmata on things, that reconfirmation that he is living the gospel fully, living Christ for others. The canticle of creation, and ultimately his death, following fully the life of Christ. So for us, the Franciscan rule that was approved in November 30, 1223, is endorsement of all the Franciscan movement, a recognition of the church that the Franciscan movement was here to stay, that out of that grows the whole Franciscan family. Because already, even though all our rules were approved after that date, they all stem from that initial experience of Francis, of living the gospel and bringing the gospel alive. And so we continue to keep looking back at our foundations, to live as servants, to live as humble people, to continue to look through the eyes of the other and the poor, and to learn and realize what Christ is calling us to do for each one of us, and to listen and bring alive the gospel. So in many ways, the approval of the rule is endorsement of the Franciscan family, because eventually it is that early inspiration that already attracted St. Clare, already attracted the secular Franciscans, the Third Order. And really the 1223 approval of the rule is about reminding everyone that we are a part of a Franciscan family started by Francis, but ultimately handed over to the church as part of the life of the church. And we as a movement are called to be part of that sense of bringing the gospel alive. That is who we are as a Franciscan family, that centrality of the gospel message. But the one thing that it does set up is that from then on, is always tension in the Franciscans. Do you live the legalism of the rule versus the spirit of the rule? And it is neither an either or. It is we are called to live both. We are called to live with that tension of living the gospel to the full, but also respecting the rules that we've been given and written, and to hold them in tension. Because that's what creates creativity. That's where we struggle. We bear our cross to bring alive the gospel. And as I said, when we either become very legalistic, or we become people who don't recognize that what the church has approved, then we lose our way. We've got to hold both of our traditions together. The life of the gospel and the life of our rules have to be held together, and to be struggled with, and to bring life, because it's in that tension of trying to live the gospel life under the authority of the church, under the approval of our rule that is our life, that is what we've been given today. And so, let us, as said, this centenary, we are here to celebrate the approval of the whole Franciscan family by the whole church.